I never imagined that a simple piece of paper could flip my entire world upside down. That morning, the sky was clear, the sun was gentle, and I had just finished watering my small garden in the front yard. A few sunflowers, one tomato plant, and a tiny wind chime hung near the porch, a gift from my niece. Life felt peaceful for a moment, until I noticed a bright pink notice slapped onto my front door. The words, "Final Warning, HOA Violation," screamed back at me, and just like that, the calm disappeared. I peeled the paper off and read through the list of so-called violations. Apparently, my garden wasn't laid out properly, the wind chime was too noisy, and my beige fence wasn't compliant with HOA color standards. I stood there holding the notice, stunned by the absurdity of it all. It had all started a few months ago when a woman named Cynthia Marlowe quietly took over as president of our neighborhood HOA. The previous president had moved away and left the role open, and Cynthia slid right in without any kind of formal vote. At first, no one paid much attention until the letters started rolling in. Warnings about flower pots, patio chairs, car models, curtain colors. She turned the HOA into her personal empire, and now I was her next target. That evening, still frustrated, I tried to reason with her at her home. Cynthia's house looked like a showroom. Perfectly trimmed hedges, artificial rocks, polished walkway tiles, everything pristine and lifeless. She greeted me like she had been expecting me, calm and smug. She already knew why I was there, and she didn't flinch. She didn't just stand by the notice she sent. She told me I had 2 days left before eviction procedures would begin for violating community standards. She actually used the word eviction like it was completely normal. I went home angry and a little shaken. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed up flipping through every page of the HOA agreement I had signed when I bought the house. And there it was, buried deep on page 46, a vague clause about removal of residents who violated policies multiple times. But it was clearly written in a way that allowed too much freedom to the board, especially someone like Cynthia. I wasn't sure what to do until I remembered an old friend from college, Sam, who had become a lawyer. I sent him an email that night, just asking for some guidance. To my surprise, he responded quickly and agreed to help. 2 days later, he arrived at my house with a folder in hand and a serious look on his face. What he found wasn't just concerning, it was outrageous. Cynthia had quietly rewritten entire sections of the HOA regulations. She added fines that never existed, snuck in clauses that allowed her to take control without a board vote, and even funneled money from the association dues into a separate operations account under her name. No one else in the neighborhood knew. People were just paying fines and staying quiet. But that wasn't all. Sam discovered that she had also filed legal paperwork giving herself the authority to enforce her changes without needing majority approval. In short, she had taken a neighborhood policy system and twisted it into a dictatorship. My frustration turned into something else. Determination. Cynthia had picked the wrong house this time. I asked Sam what could be done. Was there a way to remove her, fight back, or stop the eviction? His answer was simple but bold. Don't just fight from inside the system. Take over the system. If the HOA was the problem, then we needed to own it. I had never considered anything like that before. By the HOA? Was that even possible? But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I could gain control, I could undo the damage she caused. And maybe, just maybe, I could end the HOA altogether. That was the moment everything changed. I wasn't just defending my house anymore. I was starting a quiet war against the very system that tried to kick me out, and I was ready to go all in. Buying the HOA sounded insane at first, but the more I looked into it, the more it became clear that Cynthia's control wasn't as untouchable as she made it seem. Most people in the neighborhood were either unaware of what the HOA actually did or were too tired to fight back against the constant rule changes and fines. I started by collecting copies of every notice and letter Cynthia had ever sent me. I dug through old emails, snapped photos of community bulletins, and even interviewed neighbors who had received similar threats. What shocked me was how many people were suffering in silence. An elderly couple on the next block had been fined for installing a ramp for their son. A single mom down the street had been told her car, was a visual nuisance because it wasn't a luxury brand. A veteran neighbor had to remove his flagpole because it wasn't symmetrical enough for Cynthia's standards. The neighborhood wasn't a community anymore. It was a kingdom, and Cynthia ruled it without mercy. I kept things quiet as I gathered information. I didn't want to alert Cynthia that something was brewing. Sam helped me understand the legal structure of our HOA. It turned out the organization was set up as a nonprofit corporation, and like any corporation, it had board members, bylaws, and voting rights tied to homeownership. What Cynthia didn't count on was that many of the board members had resigned quietly or moved away, leaving only her and two others who blindly followed her lead. If enough homeowners came together to call a vote, we could challenge the leadership or even replace the entire board. But to do that, we needed one thing that no one else had tried: unity. I started knocking on doors. At first, people were skeptical. They thought I was just angry about a garden or a wind chime. But when I showed them copies of the financial records Sam had found and explained how Cynthia had been pocketing money under the table, the mood changed. Faces that once looked tired and defeated began to show sparks of interest. More neighbors joined in. We held small, quiet meetings in garages, living rooms, and backyards. I printed flyers with real numbers showing where the dues were going. I kept everything factual, respectful, and firm. No one wanted drama, but everyone wanted change. It took about 3 weeks to get enough signatures to force an emergency meeting under the HOA's own bylaws. The day we filed the petition, Cynthia tried to dismiss it, claiming it was invalid. But this time, we had a lawyer. Sam filed the challenge directly through the county clerk's office, making it legally binding. Cynthia had no choice but to hold the meeting. She scheduled it at a local community center 2 weeks later, probably hoping the momentum would die down. It didn't. In fact, it grew. The day of the meeting, I arrived early, expecting maybe 20 people to show up. I was wrong. By the time the meeting started, nearly the entire neighborhood was there. People who hadn't spoken to each other in years stood side by side, holding packets of notes, receipts, photos, and records. Cynthia walked in late, flanked by her 2 loyal board members, still wearing her signature navy blazer and carrying a folder full of notices like weapons. She looked annoyed, not worried, as if we were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. When the meeting began, she tried to control the room like she always had, talking over people, using big words, quoting bylaws without context. But this time was different. Sam stood beside me, calm and confident. He laid out everything we had found, how Cynthia rewrote rules without votes, funneled community money into her private account, and used scare tactics to threaten people with eviction that was never actually legal. The room went quiet as documents were passed around. Cynthia turned red, her voice growing louder and shakier as she tried to defend herself. She claimed it was all authorized, that she had followed procedure, that the HOA needed her structure. But no one was buying it anymore. Then came the vote. A simple ballot. Remove the current board or keep it. One by one, neighbors stood and cast their votes. It wasn't even close. 90% voted to remove Cynthia and her allies. In that moment, it was over. She stood frozen, clutching her folder, unable to speak as Sam read the results out loud. A new board would be formed, one that actually represented the community. But I wasn't interested in being president. I had a different plan, a bigger one. While Cynthia quietly stormed out of the building, I stayed behind with a few others. I asked a simple question: what if we dissolved the HOA entirely? The silence that followed was heavy. Then someone clapped. Then another. Within minutes, the room was buzzing. People were smiling, laughing, hopeful again. The neighborhood that had been trapped under rules and fear was waking up. The board had been overthrown. The power had shifted. And soon, the entire HOA itself would be gone. The days following the vote felt like the neighborhood had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. Without Cynthia's presence hovering over us, people began stepping out of their homes, smiling at each other, and sharing stories that had been bottled up for far too long. The air felt lighter, but there was still work to do. Removing the board was one thing. Dismantling the HOA entirely would be another. With the help of Sam and the new temporary committee formed during the emergency meeting, we began the process of reviewing the HOA's charter and legal structure. It wasn't easy. The original documents were vague, and Cynthia had buried the group in unnecessary red tape to keep people from even attempting change. But layer by layer, we peeled it all back. Turns out, the HOA had been formed as a voluntary association 2 decades ago, and homeowners could legally vote to disband it with a 2/3 majority. The only reason it had held so much power was because no one had challenged it before. All we needed was the courage to finish what we started. Word spread fast. The idea of living without HOA rules, fines, or fear lit a spark across the entire neighborhood. A second vote was scheduled, this time to officially dissolve the HOA. We handed out ballots door to door, explained the process in simple terms, and made sure everyone knew what was at stake. There was some hesitation, mostly from people who had grown used to the order the HOA promised. But when they saw how much had been taken from them, how the rules were used as weapons instead of guidelines, those doubts faded. A week later, we held the vote under a tent on the community park lawn. Lawn chairs filled the space, kids ran around freely, and people brought snacks like it was a block party. And in many ways it was. When the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. The HOA was no more. Cynthia, meanwhile, wasn't taking it well. After being removed, she disappeared for a few days, only to return with a cease and desist letter accusing us of fraud, harassment, and character damage. But what she didn't realize was that the very legal structure she had twisted for her own gain had now become her undoing. Sam had documented everything. Her rewritten rules, her unapproved financial withdrawals, and her unauthorized changes to voting procedures. We filed a counterclaim with the county, and a local housing authority launched a formal audit of her financial handling of HOA funds. The truth came out fast. Cynthia had used community dues to pay for her personal landscaping, luxury home upgrades, and even a cruise she claimed was for a property inspection retreat. When the authorities came knocking, she tried to deny everything, but the receipts told a different story. Her former allies abandoned her, and even her personal attorney dropped her case once the fraud charges became public. The real victory, though, wasn't in watching her fall. It was in seeing the neighborhood rise. With the HOA gone, we set up a community volunteer group, not for enforcement, but for support. A few of us, including me, started organizing monthly neighborhood days where we'd help elderly residents with yard work, fix fences, or just share a meal together. The same ramp that once got a family fine was now being rebuilt by volunteers, this time with handrails, flower beds, and solar lights donated by local businesses. We painted over the old violation office's walls and turned it into a community help center. Instead of threats, it now offered tools, gardening supplies, and even homework help for kids after school. Something remarkable happened as time passed. People began taking more pride in their homes, not because they feared fines, but because they felt connected to the place they lived. Christmas lights returned to windows, porch swings creaked in the evening breeze, and chalk drawings covered driveways with color. No one cared if your fence was a slightly different shade or if your garden didn't match a brochure. What mattered was kindness, respect, and neighborly care. It was everything Cynthia's HOA had tried to control, only now it was real. One afternoon, I received a letter from the housing authority. They had completed their investigation. Cynthia was officially barred from holding any position in a residential association again, and the state was pursuing charges for embezzlement and fraud. Justice had found her, and she had no one left to hide behind. A week later, a moving truck pulled up to her house. She didn't wave goodbye. No one came out to see her off. Her house stood empty for weeks before a new family moved in, parents with 3 kids and a Labrador. They planted sunflowers in the front yard, just like I had, and nobody said a word, except to compliment how cheerful they looked. I never thought I'd end up owning the very HOA that tried to kick me out, let alone dissolve it for good. But sometimes, the only way to fix something broken is to start fresh. We didn't just win a legal battle. We won back our homes, our voices, and our community. People often say one person can't make a difference. But I learned that one person asking the right questions, backed by truth and community, can shift everything. We're no longer just neighbors. We're a family. And as I watched kids race past my garden with laughter in their voices and the sun setting over rooftops finally free of rule books and warnings, I knew one thing for sure. This was a neighborhood I had always dreamed of, and no paper on a door could ever take that away again.